Donald Trump passed a huge tax cuts bill, and it was basically the whole thing around it, the whole argument around it. And there's really, anytime you're having a conversation with a conservative of some sort or something like that, you're having a conversation on the issue. Really, the main thing is if you want to lower the deficit, how could you possibly argue for tax cuts, which would explode the deficit? Because here's the simple situation that you're looking at. You go, okay, you're not lowering spending any at all. There's nothing in the tax cuts that say we're going to lower spending in this area, this area. No, that's not what you're doing. You're just lessening the revenue of the government. So what happens when you lessen the revenue and you keep the cost the same? The deficit is going to explode, which means the debt is in turn going to explode. And so if you're a deficit hawk or a debt hawk, how could you advocate for a bill that in its entirety is going to explode both the deficit and the debt? It doesn't make any sense. It's hypocritical. It's contradictory at its fundamental position. So it doesn't make any sense. But as one of the talking points that was quite literally written by, the Koch brothers actually distributed talking points to congressional members like Ted Cruz. That's not a conspiracy. That's a real fucking thing. One of their talking point is this. They go, oh, well, you know what? It's not going to explode the deficit, and here's why. It's because when you lower taxes, the GDP is going to go up because more people are going to be spending money, so the GDP will rise. And so it'll, people will sometimes say it's going to go, 2, 3, 4 times over, exponentially increase. It's going to exponentially increase the revenue for the government due to, the increase in GDP. Well, we have a little report from Reuters here, totally debunking that. It says tax cuts to give little lift to U.S. economy. So here's what Reuters says. They say, the economic boost from U.S. President Donald Trump's $1.5 trillion tax cut will probably fall well short of most analysts' quote, overly optimistic expectations, 2 economists wrote Monday in the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank's latest economic letter. Instead of the boost to GDP growth this year of about 1.3 percentage points, estimated by the Congressional Budget Office and other forecasters, they wrote, quote, the true boost is more likely to be less than 1 percentage point, with some studies pointing to as little as 0. That is because fiscal stimulus has a large effect on economic activity when unemployment is high and personal finances are constrained, but it delivers much less of a jolt when the economy is strong, they wrote. In June, the U.S. unemployment rate rose slightly to 4%, much lower than most economist estimates of a sustainable rate, as businesses added many more jobs than expected and more job seekers entered the labor force. Governments typically increase deficits with spending and tax cuts when times are tough, not when an economic expansion is barreling toward the longest running in U.S. history. I want to pause right there because that is sort of a sort of hilarious. That's a hilarious thing to me because it's like, okay, like you're supposed to deficit spend when you're in a recession like under Obama, because if you don't get the economy going, you're just gonna plunge yourself into debt for a really long time to come, and you're just gonna be in a slump. So you have to deficit spend to get the fuck out of that, recession. So you don't get stuck in this slump of, holy shit, every year we have a slow ass economy and we're not moving out anywhere. You have to deficit spend to invest in the economy to revive it so that you don't get stuck in this slump. And so they're like, typically the government doesn't increase their deficits while the economy is booming, because you're not. When the economy is booming, the government's supposed to be bringing a surplus like under Bill Clinton, or at least lowering the deficit like Obama did, where he brought it down to $400 billion from $1.2 trillion. You're not supposed to increase the deficit when the economy is strong. That is essentially antithetical to logic. When the government is doing well, you're supposed to have, better receipts. That's what you're supposed to have. You're supposed to have better numbers when it comes to deficit and debt. So it doesn't make any fucking sense. But it goes on. It says doing so raises concerns about the nation's capacity to combat future downturns, particularly if it does not deliver outsized economic gains in the meantime. The report suggests, quote, recent research finds that the effects of fiscal stimulus on overall economic activity are much smaller during expansions than during downturns. So what you're looking at is when you're talking about like a good economy in terms of unemployment, when you're looking specifically at unemployment rate, and when you're talking about unemployment rate, when you're going to do something like, giving tax cuts, especially ones that massively, massively benefit the wealthy, it's not going to result in much of a higher GDP because there's no real like crazy incentive for someone to act differently than they previously did. So it's going to give either a much smaller than expected effect on the GDP, or, as some studies point to, almost zero, if zero. So it's a complete wash. It's a hogwash and a lie. The idea that somehow, the GDP rising from giving tax cuts, minor ones to the poor and then huge, ginormous ones to the rich, is somehow going to increase the GDP when the economy is already doing well and there's no incentive to up the GDP or to spend more in any way. It doesn't make any sense. So this kind of stuff is shitty Republican, economics, and it really is gonna be shit. Really, really bad for the debt and the deficit, and the supposed debt and deficit hawks have seemingly turned on their supposed principles.